The wind came first, a low moan across the Wyoming plains that promised nothing but trouble. Matthew Rourke felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that spoke of snow and ice and the kind of cold that could freeze a man's soul. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter around his neck and urged his horse. Ajax, onward. The sky, a placid gray an hour ago, was now the color of a fresh bruise, churning and heavy. He was 3 days out from delivering a herd of cattle, the pay tucked securely in his saddlebag, and all he wanted was the warmth of his rented line cabin on the ridge. But the world was turning white around him, the landmarks he knew by heart vanishing into a swirling curtain of snow. Matthew was a man made of silence and sharp edges. The war had carved away anything soft in him, and the years since had only honed him down further. Men in town said he was fair, that his word was as solid as the granite mountains to the west, but they said it from a distance. They saw the sadness in his eyes, a deep, guarded place they knew better than to trespass upon. He had come to this part of the country not to find something, but to lose the ghosts that followed him. He had not been successful. They were as relentless as the Wyoming winter. The snow was coming down thick now, driven by a wind that bit and tore at him. Ajax lowered his head, his powerful body pushing through the deepening drifts. Matthew could no longer see the familiar shape of the hills. He was navigating by instinct, by the feel of the land beneath his horse's hooves. He knew he was close to the old Elmswood place, a patch of land no one wanted, especially not now. The cabin had burned down a month or so back, taking Elias Elmswood and his wife, Clara, with it, or so the story went. Matthew had paid the gossip little mind. A man's troubles were his own, and death was a common enough neighbor out here. But the burned cabin was a landmark, a black scar on the land that even a blizzard might not completely hide. It was his only chance of getting his bearings. He squinted, his eyes watering from the cold, and saw it. A dark smudge against the blinding white, the jagged silhouette of a stone chimney standing like a broken tooth. He steered Ajax toward it, not for shelter, but for a moment's certainty in a world that had lost its shape. The ruin was a desolate sight. Charred beams lay crisscrossed like the bones of some great beast, their blackness a stark protest against the purity of the snow. The roof was gone, save for a few skeletal rafters. The wind howled through the empty window frames, a mournful, hollow sound. Matthew dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the powder. He led Ajax toward the relative shelter of the chimney stack, his gloved hand resting on the horse's neck to soothe him. The animal was uneasy, his ears twitching, his breath pluming in frosty clouds. It was then that Matthew heard it, a sound so faint it was almost part of the wind, a soft whimper of pain. He froze, his hand tightening on his rifle. It could be a coyote, or a wolf caught in the ruin. He scanned the wreckage, his eyes accustomed to picking out detail where others saw none. The sound came again, from beneath a large, slanted section of what used to be the roof, now resting against a collapsed wall. It was not the sound of an animal. It was human. He drew his pistol, his movements slow and deliberate. He trusted nothing in this unforgiving land. He crept closer, the crunch of his boots muffled by the falling snow. He peered into the darkness of the makeshift shelter. At first, he saw only a pile of rags, indistinguishable from the other debris. Then the rags moved, and a face turned toward him. It was a woman. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted with soot and ice. Her face was deathly pale, her lips a frightening shade of blue. Her dress was thin cotton, torn and blackened, offering no protection from the brutal cold. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were wide with a terror so profound it seemed ancient. The eyes of a hunted animal that knows the trap is about to spring. It was Clara Elmswood. He stood there, stunned into stillness. The town had buried her in their minds, written her off as ash and memory. Yet here she was, a ghost made of flesh and freezing blood. She tried to push herself further back into the cramped space, a weak, desperate movement. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible over the storm. "Don't." Matthew holstered his pistol. He knelt, his knees sinking into the snow. "Ma'am," he said, his own voice sounding rough and loud in the muffled quiet. "You'll die out here." Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and he thought she had lost consciousness. But they opened again, and a desperate clarity burned in them. "Let me," she breathed. "It's better." She saw the direction of his gaze, toward the distant lights of the town, buried in the storm. "Do not take me back there. Please, do not tell anyone you found me." Her plea struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not a request. It was a prayer born of absolute desperation. He was a man who had spent his life avoiding the complications of other people's lives. But to leave her here was to condemn her to a slow, agonizing death. To take her back to town was to betray the desperate wish of a woman who looked as if she had already lost everything. He made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He unstrapped the heavy wool bedroll from behind his saddle. "I am not taking you to town," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I am not leaving you here." He wrapped her in the bedroll, his movements gentle but efficient. She was lighter than a child, a fragile collection of bones that trembled uncontrollably in his arms. She gave another weak whimper, a sound of surrender or fear. He could not tell which. He lifted her easily and placed her sideways on Ajax's saddle, climbing up behind her to hold her steady. He turned the horse away from the ruin, away from the memory of the fire, and into the heart of the storm. A living woman and her secret held close against his chest. The line cabin was a small, solitary box against the vast emptiness of the plains. It was a place for a man to be alone with his thoughts, built of rough-hewn logs with a single stone fireplace, a cot, a small table, and 2 chairs. It was not a home. It was a shelter, and tonight it would have to be enough. He carried Clara inside and laid her on the cot near the hearth. She was barely conscious now, her body limp, the chill coming off her so deep it felt like it was radiating from her very bones. Matthew worked with a grim focus he had learned in the war. He packed snow away from the fireplace, struck a match, and coaxed a small flame to life, feeding it kindling until it grew into a roaring blaze that pushed back the cabin's gloom. The warmth began to fill the small space, and Clara began to shiver violently, a sign that life was fighting back against the cold. He knew he had to be careful. He took his knife and cut away the frozen, stiffened fabric of her dress. Beneath it, her skin was mottled and pale. Her fingers and the toes of her bare feet were waxy and white. Frostbite. He cursed under his breath. He filled a basin with snow and began to rub her hands and feet with it, a slow, methodical friction to bring the life back without causing more damage. She moaned, a low, continuous sound of pain as the feeling began to return to her frozen flesh. He ignored it and kept working, his touch impersonal, his focus absolute. When he was done, he wrapped her hands and feet in strips of clean cloth torn from one of his own shirts. He found his last spare blanket and covered her, tucking it in tightly around her frail body. For 2 days, the blizzard raged, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Clara drifted in a feverish state between consciousness and delirium. She would murmur names he did not know and cry out in her sleep. In her more lucid moments, she would watch him, her eyes filled with a weary, questioning fear. He said little, simply tending the fire, melting snow for water, and forcing her to drink the thin broth he made from a piece of dried venison. He learned that she had been hiding in the ruins for nearly 4 days, surviving on nothing but melted snow, ever since the night of the fire. The thought of it, of her will to endure, settled in him like a stone. The town had dismissed her as a thief's accomplice, a woman of weak character. The town was wrong. On the 3rd day, the wind died, and the sun rose in a sky of brilliant, painful blue, illuminating a world transformed by snow. Clara was awake, her fever broken. She was weak, her body a canvas of aches, but her eyes were clear. She sat propped up on the cot, clutching the blanket to her chin. "Thank you," she whispered. The words seemed to cost her a great deal of effort. Matthew nodded, sipping his coffee by the fire. "You need food. Proper food. I have to go to town for supplies." Panic flared in her eyes. "No, they will ask questions. They will know." "They will not know," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am a solitary man, Mrs. Elmswood. No one pays my business any mind. You will stay here. Bolt the door. Do not answer it for anyone." She nodded, though the fear did not leave her face. He left her with a stack of firewood, a bucket of water, and his rifle propped against the wall. As he rode away, he had the strange feeling that he was leaving a part of himself behind in that cabin, a part he had not realized was still capable of concern. The town was slowly digging itself out from under the blanket of snow. Smoke curled from every chimney, and the sound of shovels scraping against wood was the only industry. Matthew tied Ajax to the hitching post outside the general store and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, tobacco, and damp wool. A half-dozen men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their voices low. He gathered his supplies, flour, salt, coffee, beans, and bacon, and listened. As he had expected, the talk was of the Elmswood fire. "Serves him right," said a portly man named Abernathy, who owned the livery. "Alias was a snake. Knew it the first time I saw him." "Took the gold shipment. That is what I heard," another added. "Was supposed to be guarding it for Frank Dolly, and it just up and vanished. Next thing you know, his house is a pile of ash." Frank Dolly. Matthew knew him. A rancher with a greedy streak and an ambition that far outstripped his sense of honor. Dolly had always wanted the Elmswood parcel, not for its quality, but for its access to the creek. "What about his wife?" the storekeeper asked, weighing out Matthew's flour. Abernathy spat a stream of tobacco juice into the brass spittoon. "The wife, she was in on it. Had to be. Quiet thing. The quiet ones are always the worst. Looked down her nose at the whole town. She did. Too good for us. Well, she got what was coming to her. A thief's wife is no better than a thief. Burned up right alongside him. I reckon. Good riddance." The other men murmured in agreement. There was no pity in their words, only a cold, self-righteous satisfaction. They had tried and convicted Clara Elmswood in their minds long before the fire, branding her guilty by her association with a man they despised and for the crime of being an outsider. Matthew paid for his goods, his face an unreadable mask. He said nothing, but a cold anger coiled in his gut. He had seen this kind of mob justice before. It never ended well. He returned to the cabin to find the door bolted, just as he had instructed. He knocked twice, a specific rhythm he had not told her but trusted she would understand. After a long moment, the bolt slid back. Clara stood there, the rifle held loosely in her hands, her face pale and strained. She saw the sacks of supplies in his arms, and a measure of the tension left her shoulders. He did not tell her what he had heard. He did not need to. She had been living with their judgment for months. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the constant, hunted look in her eyes. He put the supplies away and started a fire to cook a proper meal. A silent routine began to form between them. He would rise before dawn and ride out to check his fences and the small herd of cattle he watched over for the big ranch down south. He would return in the late afternoon. At first, he would leave the fresh supplies or any game he had shot on the small porch, a silent offering before retreating to sleep in the cold, cramped lean-to where he stored his tack. He was determined not to get involved. This was not his fight. He was a man who knew the cost of fighting for others, a cost paid in blood and loss, a cost memorialized by the broken locket he wore under his shirt, a constant, cold weight against his skin. But he could not maintain the distance. He started finding a cup of coffee left for him on the hearth. Still warm. He found a tear in his coat had been mended with small, neat stitches. One day, he returned to the smell of fresh bread and found a small, perfectly formed loaf sitting on the table. These quiet acts of gratitude were more disarming than any words of thanks. They were a language of survival and mutual respect, a language he understood. He began to come inside in the evenings. They would sit in the flickering firelight, the silence stretching between them, thick with all the things they did not say. He learned to read the landscape of her face, to see the flicker of fear in her eyes when the wind howled, to notice the slight trembling of her hands when she thought he was not looking. And he saw something else, too, a resilience that was as strong and unyielding as the mountains. She had survived her husband. She had survived a fire, and she had survived 4 days in a blizzard. She was not the weak, conniving woman the town had painted her to be. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a tentative trust. She no longer flinched when he moved suddenly. She began to meet his gaze instead of staring at the floor. The cabin, once just a shelter for him, started to feel different. Her presence had filled the empty spaces, chasing away some of the loneliness that had been his only companion for so long. The quiet was no longer empty. It was shared. One night, another storm blew in, rattling the windows and shaking the sturdy log walls. It was not a blizzard, but the sound of the wind was a cruel reminder of the night he had found her. Clara was more withdrawn than usual. Her shoulders hunched as she stared into the flames, lost in a place he could not go. Matthew watched her for a long time before banking the fire for the night. He rose, ready to head out to the lean-to. It was his routine, his way of giving her the safety and privacy of the cabin. He was halfway to the door when her voice, small and fragile as a bird's wing, stopped him. "Don't leave." He turned. She was curled in a blanket on the floor by the hearth, her back to him. He thought he had misheard. But then she said it again, her voice clearer this time. Though it was barely a whisper, it was a plea, stripped of all pride, dredged up from a place of deep, primal fear. "Don't leave," she said, "until I fall asleep." Matthew looked at the woman by the fire, a survivor who had been cast out by the world. He looked at the heavy cabin door, and beyond it, the cold, howling dark. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg. He unbuckled his gun belt and laid it carefully on the table. He walked back to the chair on the other side of the hearth, sat down, and leaned his head back against the rough-hewn logs. He did not speak. He just watched the flames dance and listened to the sound of her breathing as it slowly, finally, deepened into the trusting peace of sleep, and he stayed. That first night set a new pattern. Matthew no longer retreated to the lean-to. The unspoken arrangement was that he would keep watch in the chair until Clara's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep, a peace she only seemed to find when she knew he was there, in the mornings. He would be gone before she woke, out checking his lines, leaving her the illusion of solitude. But the cabin was no longer just his shelter. It was becoming a shared space, a fragile world with its own silent rules. Clara, in turn, began to reclaim the small territory. She moved with a quiet purposefulness, her earlier, skittish movements slowly giving way to a gentle industry. The first time he came back to find his spare shirt, the one he'd torn for her bandages, mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He stood holding it for a long moment. It was an act of care he hadn't known in years. Soon, the scent of wood smoke and coffee in the cabin was joined by the smell of baking bread or a simmering stew. She cooked with a deftness that spoke of long practice, transforming his simple stores of flour, beans, and salted meat into meals that tasted of something more than mere sustenance. She was putting a home back into the hollowed-out shell of the cabin, and, Matthew feared, into the hollowed-out shell of him. She never spoke of her past. He would watch her sometimes as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, and he could see the shadows that lived behind her eyes. He would ask a simple question, "Did you grow up in this territory?" And she would go still, the light in her expression dimming. "Not far from here." She would say, her voice soft and non-committal, and the conversation would end. He learned not to push. Her history was a wounded thing, and he understood that some wounds were too raw to bear the weight of words. He had his own. The supplies began to run low again. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee was down to its last few grounds. Matthew knew he could not put off a trip to town any longer, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach at the thought. The town was a place of judgment, its people a jury that had already passed their sentence on Clara. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in him, an emotion he had thought long dead and buried. "I have to ride in," he told her one morning, his voice gruff to hide his reluctance. "We need provisions." Fear, immediate and sharp, flashed across her face. She nodded, her hands twisting in the folds of her worn dress, a garment he had bought for her on his last trip, leaving it on the table without a word. "Be careful, Matthew." It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded strange and oddly intimate in the quiet of the cabin. He simply nodded, put on his coat, and left before he could say something he might regret. The ride to town was cold, the air crisp and clean beneath a vast, indifferent sky. He felt the weight of Frank Dolly's stare from his last visit, a memory that had been nagging at him for weeks. Dolly was a man who saw the world in terms of what he could take, and he had wanted the Elmswood land, with Elias and Clara presumed dead. The land was unclaimed, ripe for the picking. A living Clara Elmswood was a complication Dolly would not welcome. In the general store, the stove was once again the center of the universe. The talk, however, had shifted. A trapper named Silas, a man whose face was a roadmap of frostbite and hard living, was holding court. "Saw it myself, 2 nights past," Silas was saying, his voice raspy. "Was checking my lines up on the ridge, near dusk. Saw a light in the window of that old line cabin Rourke's renting." Matthew, who had been gathering his goods at the back of the store, went still. "Probably just Rourke himself," the storekeeper mumbled, not looking up from his ledger. "No," Silas insisted, shaking his head. "The light went out the second my horse made a sound, and I saw a figure in the window, just for a second. Looked like a woman, a pale woman, with fair hair." He lowered his voice theatrically. "Looked like a ghost." A nervous silence fell over the men. Abernathy, the livery owner, broke it with a scoff. "You've been sipping too much of your own trade. Silas, it's the Elmswood woman you're thinking of. The fire got her. Everyone knows that." From the corner of his eye, Matthew saw Frank Dolly shift his weight. Dolly hadn't said a word, but his eyes, small and hard as pebbles, were fixed on Matthew. There was a smug, knowing look on his face that made the hair on Matthew's arms stand on end. Dolly knew something, or suspected it. He was a predator who had scented his prey. Matthew paid for his supplies, his movements calm and measured, betraying none of the cold dread that was seeping into his bones. As he was leaving, Dolly stepped into his path. "Rourke," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Keeping warm up on that ridge all by your lonesome?" The question was casual, but the implication was as sharp as a knife's edge. "Warm enough," Matthew replied, his voice flat. He met Dolly's gaze, holding it for a long, silent moment. It was a declaration of territory, a warning. Dolly's lips twisted into a thin smile before he stepped aside. The ride back to the cabin was long. The winter landscape, usually a source of stark comfort to him, felt menacing, filled with watching eyes. Dolly's suspicion was a threat that now hung over them, as real and as dangerous as a winter storm. He thought of Clara, alone in the cabin, a ghost to the world, a secret he was now bound to keep. His hand, as it often did when his thoughts grew dark, went to the small, cool lump of metal he wore on a leather cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. The locket was old silver, tarnished and dented. Its clasp was broken. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Nothing just two empty, concave spaces where tiny portraits should have been. It had belonged to his brother, Samuel. The memory came unbidden, as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. The sun, hot and unforgiving on the Texas plains. The smell of dust and fear. He was 17, all sinew and pride, and Samuel was 8, a small, bright flame of a boy who followed him everywhere. The Comanche came at dawn. They were a whirlwind of noise and violence, of painted faces and the terrifying, high-pitched cries of warriors. His father had yelled for him to get Samuel to the root cellar. He had grabbed his brother's hand, so small and fragile in his own, and he had run, but he had not been fast enough. An arrow, meant for him, had struck Samuel in the chest. The boy had fallen without a sound, his eyes wide with a surprise that would haunt Matthew for the rest of his life. He had knelt there, helpless, as the life faded from his brother's face, the attack raging around him. Later, after they had buried what was left of his family, he had found the locket in the blood-soaked dirt. Its chain snapped. He had put it around his neck, and he had never taken it off. It was his penance, a constant, physical reminder of his failure. He had failed to protect the one person who had trusted him completely. He would not fail again. He found Clara by the fire, her hands busy mending one of his blankets. She looked up when he entered, her eyes searching his face, and she knew at once that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He did not want to frighten her, but she deserved the truth. "There is talk in town," he said, unloading the supplies. "A trapper thinks he saw a light, a figure in the window." He paused. Dolly was there. "He is suspicious." The color drained from her face. She set the blanket aside, her hands trembling. "What are we going to do?" "We do nothing," he said, his voice firm. "We stay quiet. We stay careful." That evening, the tension between them was a palpable thing. After their meager supper, he noticed her rubbing her hands, her face tight with pain. The frostbite had healed, but the cold still settled deep in her bones, causing the joints of her fingers to ache. "Let me see," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She hesitated, then held out her hands. He took them in his own. Her skin was cool, the knuckles swollen and red. He gently massaged them, his rough, calloused thumbs moving in slow circles. It was the first time he had touched her since that first night, not as a rescuer, but as something else entirely. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. "I married Elias when I was 16, she said, her voice so low he had to lean closer to hear. The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally broken. "My uncle. After my parents died, I went to live with him. He was not a kind man. Elias was a way out. I thought he was—" She took a shaky breath. "He was charming at first. He promised me a home, a life away from all that. But the charm wore off. Out here, with no one to see. He had a temper. It got worse over the years. The more he drank, the worse it got." She did not need to say more. Matthew had seen men like Elias, men who hid their cruelty behind a veneer of civility, men who preyed on the vulnerable. He looked at Clara, at the faint, faded scar near her temple, partially hidden by her hair. He understood now the source of her skittishness, the deep, ingrained fear of a sudden movement, a raised voice. She was not just hiding from the town's judgment, she was hiding from the ghost of her husband. A strand of her pale hair had fallen across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed it back. She flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk, her whole body going rigid, but she did not pull away. She held his gaze, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight, filled with a confused mix of fear and something else, something he dared not name. He let his hand drop. The air in the cabin crackled with unspoken emotion. A few nights later, the storm that had been brewing in her mind finally broke. Matthew was dozing in his chair, the fire burning down to glowing embers, when a sound from the cot jolted him awake. It was a choked cry, a sound of pure terror. He was on his feet in an instant. Clara was thrashing in her sleep, tangled in her blanket, her face contorted in a mask of agony.
"No,"
she whimpered, her voice thick with sleep.
"Please, Elias, no."
He moved to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder, meaning only to wake her from the nightmare. Her eyes flew open, but they were unseeing, still trapped in the dream. She let out a terrified sob and lunged forward, her hands clutching the front of his shirt with surprising strength.
"Don't go,"
she gasped, her knuckles white.
"Don't leave me with him. Please, don't leave me."
Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just afraid of being alone in the dark. She was afraid of the man who haunted her sleep. Her fear was a living thing, and in that moment, he was her only anchor in a sea of terror. "I am here," he said, his voice low and steady.
"You are safe. He is not here."
He kept repeating the words, his voice a calm, even presence in the frantic chaos of her fear. Slowly, the terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning awareness. She looked at her hands, still clenched tightly in his shirt, and a deep flush of shame spread across her cheeks. She started to pull away, but her grip faltered, and she did not let go completely. The nightmare had left her trembling and exhausted. He knew he could not leave her. To walk away now would be an act of cruelty. He could not sit in the chair. It felt too far, too detached. He made a decision that felt both necessary and monumental. He gently eased her back onto the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. He did not pull his shirt from her grasp. Instead, he went to the hearth, with movements that were quiet and deliberate. He bent down and pulled off his heavy, mud-caked boots, setting them softly on the stone. The act felt strangely significant, a shedding of his outer defenses, a surrender to the intimacy of the moment. He took the blanket from his chair and lay down on the braided rug before the fire, his body a silent barrier between her and the door, between her and the ghosts of the night. He lay on his side, facing her, his shirt still loosely held in her sleeping hand. He did not sleep. He watched the last of the embers glow and fade. He listened to the sound of the wind outside and the sound of her breathing inside, a sound that slowly, finally, lost its ragged edge of fear. The relationship between them had been a thing of silences and shared spaces, a careful dance around their respective pains. But tonight, a line had been crossed. Desire, unspoken and unacknowledged, began to surface in the quiet of the cabin. It was not a fire, but a slow-building heat, born not of passion, but of shared vulnerability and a desperate human need for comfort. He lay there until the first pale light of dawn crept through the single window, a silent guardian in the long, dark night. The morning after the nightmare, a new kind of silence settled over the cabin. It was not the empty silence of before, nor the comfortable quiet that had grown between them. It was a fragile, charged stillness, thick with the memory of her terror and his steadfast presence on the floor. Clara moved about the small space with her eyes downcast, a faint blush on her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of the fire. She was ashamed of her weakness, of the desperate way she had clung to him. Matthew, for his part, was gruff and withdrawn, his movements more clipped and precise than usual. He felt as if he had crossed a threshold into a territory he did not understand, a place of feelings and vulnerabilities he had long since walled off. He had stayed, and in staying, something between them had irrevocably shifted. He no longer went out to the lean-to. The unspoken agreement was that the rug before the hearth was his place for the night. It was a strange sort of domesticity, this life they had fallen into. They were like a married couple in all the quiet ways, sharing meals, tending the fire, mending clothes, but without a single touch or word of affection passing between them. He would watch her as she kneaded dough, her hands sure and capable, and a feeling he could not name would stir in his chest. It was a dangerous feeling, a warmth that threatened to thaw the frozen landscape of his heart. He fought it, reminding himself of Samuel, of the locket against his skin, of the cost of caring for someone. He was a man meant for solitude. 2 weeks passed in this manner, a delicate truce with the world and with each other. The snows began to melt under a strengthening sun, revealing the brown, sleeping earth beneath. The threat of Frank Dolly had receded to a low hum of anxiety in the back of their minds. They had grown careful, never lighting a lamp after dusk, speaking in low voices, living like shadows on the ridge. The cabin had become their sanctuary, a world unto itself. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Matthew was cleaning his rifle by the fire, and Clara was humming softly to herself as she stitched a patch onto his worn trousers. The sound of approaching horses sent a jolt of ice through the cabin's warmth. They looked at each other, their eyes wide. It was not the sound of a single horse, but of several, moving with a confident, purposeful tread. "The loft," Matthew said, his voice a low command. "Now," and not a sound. Clara moved without a word, her face a mask of stark terror. She scrambled up the crude ladder to the small, dark space beneath the eaves, pulling the ladder up behind her just as the riders came into the clearing. Matthew stood, his rifle held loosely in his hand, and moved to the door, his body a solid, unmoving presence. He watched through a crack in the logs as 3 men dismounted. Frank Dolly, his face set in a look of smug authority, and 2 of his ranch hands, burly men with mean, empty eyes. A sharp rap on the door echoed through the cabin. Matthew took a deep breath, his face settling into a hard, unreadable mask. He opened the door a few inches and stood blocking the entrance. "Dolly," he said, his voice flat. "Rourke," Dolly replied, a thin, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding hills. "Lost a few head of cattle in the last melt. Thought they might have wandered up this way. Mind if we take a look around?" It was a lie, and they both knew it. Dolly's eyes were not on the hills. They were trying to peer past Matthew into the cabin's interior. "They are not here," Matthew said. "I would have seen them." "Humor me," Dolly said, his smile widening. He took a step forward. A clear challenge. "Just a quick look. It is a cold day. A man could use a moment by a fire." Matthew did not move. He could feel the weight of his pistol on his hip, a cold, reassuring pressure. He could also feel the weight of Clara's terrified silence from the loft above. A single wrong move, a single flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, and it would all be over. "I live alone." "Dolly," he said, his voice as cold and hard as river stone, "and I do not much care for company. You can look around the ridge all you want, but you are not coming in my cabin." For a long, tense moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Dolly's ranch hands shifted their weight, their hands moving closer to the pistols on their hips. Dolly's eyes flickered around the clearing, and then they narrowed. He had seen it, the second set of footprints in the mud near the door, smaller and lighter than Matthew's. They were faint, but they were there. He looked back at Matthew, and his smile was no longer just smug. It was triumphant. He had his answer. "Have it your way, Rourke," he said, backing down. But his tone made it clear this was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. "But a man gets lonely up here. If you happen to see a ghost wandering about, you let me know." He turned and mounted his horse, his men following suit. They rode away without a backward glance, their laughter carrying on the crisp air, a sound that was both mocking and menacing. Matthew stood at the door until they were long out of sight. He closed it and slid the heavy bolt into place. The silence in the cabin was so complete he could hear the frantic beating of his own heart. "They are gone," he said, his voice rough. Slowly, the ladder was lowered, and Clara descended. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her face was ashen, her eyes dark pools of fear. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her splintering world together.
He knows,
she whispered.
He knows I am here.
He suspects, Matthew corrected her, though the distinction offered little comfort. He has no proof.
He will not stop,
she said, her voice hollow.
He wanted our land. Elias told me Dolly threatened him, told him he would find a way to get it, one way or another. After the gold shipment vanished, everyone just assumed Elias was the thief. It was too convenient.
She sank into a chair by the fire, her body drained of all strength. She stared into the flames for a long time, her expression a mixture of fear and a terrible, weary resignation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible.
Elias might have hidden something,
she said, not looking at him. In the ruins. Matthew went still.
Hidden what?
The gold? She shook her head, a small, tired movement. I do not know. He was a man of secrets. The last few weeks, he was different. He was jumpy, always looking over his shoulder. He started talking about leaving, about starting over somewhere new. He said he had a way, that he had put something aside for us. She let out a dry, mirthless laugh. I did not believe him. I did not believe anything he said anymore, but he spent a lot of time out by the old chimney stack, poking around, prying at the stones. She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, bottomless shame. I never believed he was innocent. Matthew, I knew what kind of man he was. I had nowhere else to go. Her confession hung in the air between them, a raw and painful thing. She was not just admitting her husband was a thief. She was admitting her own helplessness, her own complicity of silence. Matthew felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the man who had trapped her, who had left her to carry the weight of his sins. We will go tonight, he said, his voice decisive. After the moon has set, we will see what your husband left behind. The night was cold and starless, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, Matthew in the lead with a rifle and a shovel, Clara following close behind, a lantern held in her trembling hand. The burned-out shell of her former home looked even more desolate in the dark, a skeletal ruin against the black sky. Where? Matthew asked, his voice a low whisper. Clara pointed to the base of the chimney, to a large, flat hearthstone that had cracked in the heat of the fire.
Under there. I saw him prying at it once.
Matthew jammed the tip of the shovel into the crack and heaved. The stone was heavy, but it shifted with a low groan. He worked the shovel under the edge and, with a great effort, levered the massive stone up and over, revealing the dark, packed earth beneath. He began to dig. The ground was cold and hard, the sound of the shovel scraping against dirt and rock loud in the oppressive silence. Clara held the lantern high, its yellow light casting long, dancing shadows. After a few minutes of digging, the shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs. He knelt and dug with his bare hands, pulling away the loose dirt. His fingers closed around the edges of a tin box. It was a simple deed box, rusted and damp from its time in the earth. He lifted it out and set it on the ground between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The box held all the answers, all the possibilities. It could hold the stolen gold, proof of Elias's guilt. It could hold papers, a deed, something that could either save Clara or condemn her forever.
Open it,
she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of dread and a desperate, flickering hope. Matthew took his knife and pried at the rusted clasp. It resisted for a moment, then snapped open with a sharp crack. He lifted the lid. The lantern light fell into the box, illuminating its contents. It was empty. A deep, profound silence fell over the ruins, broken only by the sighing of the wind. The box was not just empty of gold. It was empty of everything, empty of papers, of money, of any sign that Elias had planned for a future that included her. There was nothing. Clara stared into the empty box, her face uncomprehending at first. Then, a slow, terrible understanding dawned in her eyes. The hope that had flickered within her died, leaving behind an agony that was worse than anything she had felt before. Elias had not been putting something aside for them. He had been planning to run. The gold, the talk of a new life. It had all been for him, and him alone. He had never intended to take her with him. He was going to take the gold and vanish, leaving her behind to face the accusations, the whispers, the wrath of men like Frank Dawley. The fire had been an accident that had thwarted his escape, but his betrayal had been deliberate. A sound escaped her, a low, guttural cry of pure anguish. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of the last thread of a life she had clung to finally snapping. Her body began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that had nothing to do with the cold night air. It was the shaking of a soul that had been utterly and completely betrayed. Matthew moved without thinking. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her trembling body. He held her tightly, as if he could absorb the force of her pain, as if his own strength could hold her together while she fell apart. She buried her face in his coat, her body racked with silent, tearing sobs. He said nothing. There were no words for this kind of pain, no comfort he could offer that would be anything but an empty platitude. So he just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the maelstrom of her grief. He held her there in the dark, amidst the ashes of her old life, a silent witness to her final, devastating loss. They returned to the cabin as the first hint of gray was touching the eastern sky. The emotional storm had passed, leaving Clara in a state of quiet, hollowed-out exhaustion. The last of her illusions were gone, and while the truth was a bitter and painful thing, there was a strange kind of freedom in it. She was no longer a thief's wife, waiting for a ghost. She was just a woman who had survived. The intimacy that had been forged in the ruins was different from what had come before. It was deeper, quieter, rooted in a shared knowledge of her deepest wound. But as Matthew helped her into the cabin, she gently pulled away from his supporting arm. "I am all right," she said, her voice husky from crying. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and direct, though shadowed with pain. "Thank you, Matthew, for everything." She took a small, steadying breath. I am not ready to be touched. Not like that. I do not think I will ever be." It was a boundary, clearly and bravely drawn, a declaration of her own brokenness. He understood. He had his own. He simply nodded, his expression giving nothing away, but a deep, aching respect for her settled in his heart. That night, she laid her bedroll by the fire as usual. Matthew took his place in the chair, the familiar routine a small comfort in the wake of the night's emotional upheaval. The fire crackled, the wind whispered outside, and the silence stretched between them. He thought she had fallen asleep when her hand reached across the space between them and gently rested on his arm. Her touch was light as a feather, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through him. He looked down and saw her watching him, her eyes luminous in the firelight. "Please stay," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, stripped of the fear and desperation it had held before. It was a simple, quiet request, an offering of trust. "Just until I fall asleep." He placed his own hand over hers, his rough, calloused fingers covering her smaller, more delicate ones. He did not speak. He just sat there, their hands joined in the warm glow of the fire. And he stayed. Frank Dawley's veiled threat lingered in the air long after he was gone, a poison that seeped into the fragile peace of the cabin, the knowledge that he was being watched, that Clara's existence was a secret held on a fraying thread, settled in Matthew's gut like a cold stone. He became more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. But the true change was in the silence between him and Clara. It was no longer a space of growing comfort, but one filled with a shared, unspoken dread.
A few days later, he rode into town for salt and coffee, a necessary risk. As he was tying Ajax to the hitching post, Sheriff Brody stepped out of his office. He was a decent man, as far as lawmen went, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much trouble. "Rourke," he said, his tone casual, but his gaze was sharp. "Got a minute?" Matthew followed him into the small, dusty office. Brody gestured to a chair and then sat behind his desk, leaning back with a sigh. "Frank Dawley has been in my ear," he said, getting straight to the point. "He is convinced you are not living alone up on that ridge. He is spinning all sorts of tales, talking about reopening the inquest into the Elmswood fire." Matthew's face remained a stony mask. "Dawley talks a lot, mostly about things that are not his business." "Maybe so," Brody conceded. "But he is a man with influence. He has got folks whispering again. About the stolen gold, about Clara Elmswood. Some people are saying her ghost is haunting the ridge. Others are saying something else entirely." The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Matthew's. "I am a man who likes things simple. Rourke, a fire, 2 people dead. It is a tragedy, but it is a closed book. Dawley wants to tear the pages out and write a new story. All I'm asking is there anything up on that ridge that I should know about?" It was a direct question, posed as a piece of friendly advice. It was also a warning. The town's machinery of suspicion was grinding into motion, and Dawley was the one turning the crank. "I am a private man. Sheriff," Matthew said, his voice low and even. "I keep to myself. There is nothing on that ridge that concerns the law." Brody held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Rourke, but you watch your back. Frank Dawley is like a dog with a bone, and he thinks you are hiding it." Matthew left the office with the sheriff's words echoing in his ears. As he crossed the muddy street, he saw Dawley standing on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, watching him. There was no pretense this time, no false talk of lost cattle. Dawley's face was a mask of smug certainty. Matthew changed his course and walked directly toward him. "Stay off my ridge." "Dawley," Matthew said, his voice a low growl. He stopped a foot in front of him, close enough that Dawley had to crane his neck to look up at him. Dawley's lips curled into a sneer. "That ridge is not yours, Rourke. Neither is what you are hiding on it." He lowered his voice, his words laced with venom. "I know she is up there, and I will have her. The law wants to talk to a thief's wife. There are charges to be answered. You are harboring a fugitive. I could have you arrested right now." "You do not have the authority," Matthew said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I will get it," Dawley hissed. "One way or another, I will drag her down from that hill and see her stand trial. And when she is gone, that land, and whatever is on it, will be mine. You cannot protect her forever." Matthew leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You come up on my ridge again. You will not be coming back down." He turned and walked away, not waiting for a reply. He could feel Dawley's hateful stare on his back all the way to the general store. The confrontation had changed everything. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was a promise. He told Clara what had happened as soon as he returned. He did not soften the words. She deserved the truth, as ugly as it was. As she listened, the color drained from her face, leaving it pale and translucent. The old, hunted look returned to her eyes, sharper and more desperate than ever before. When he was finished, she stood up, her movements jerky and stiff. She went to the cot and began to gather the few meager possessions she had: the mended dress, a comb he had bought her, a small book of poems she had found on a shelf. She wrapped them in a spare blanket, her hands moving with a frantic, desperate energy. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he already knew. "I am leaving," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "Tonight. He will not stop until he has me. I will not bring this trouble to your door. Matthew, you have done more for me than anyone. I will not be the reason you get hurt."
"And where will you go?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he did not want to name. "Another ruin? The mountains. The next storm will kill you." "It is better than being dragged back there," she said, her back still to him. "Better than being put in a cage. I will take my chances." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and put his hand on her arm. She flinched, but did not pull away. "Stop," he said, his voice low but firm. "You are not running." She finally turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have to. Do you not see? I am a danger to you. As long as I am here, he will come for you." "Let him come," Matthews said, his jaw tight. "No!" she cried, a raw, desperate sound. "I will not be the cause of more violence. I have seen what men like him do. I have lived with it. I will not have your blood on my hands." "This is not about you," he said, and the words surprised him with their intensity. "This is about him. About a man who thinks he can take whatever he wants. About a town that is ready to condemn a woman they do not even know." He looked at her, at the fear and the resilience warring in her eyes, and a truth he had been fighting for weeks finally broke through his defenses. He was not just protecting her out of a sense of duty. It was more than that. It was a choice. "You do not have to run anymore. Clara, you are staying here." His words, spoken with such quiet, unshakable certainty, seemed to extinguish the frantic energy within her. Her shoulders slumped, and the bundle fell from her hands. She looked at him, her expression lost and confused, as if she could not comprehend a world in which someone would choose to stand beside her. Before she could answer, the world outside made the decision for them. The wind, which had been picking up all afternoon, suddenly let out a low, mournful howl. The sky, a placid gray moments before, had turned the color of lead. A single, fat snowflake drifted past the window, then another, and then a cascade. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick and white. The blizzard came on with a sudden, savage fury, a white monster that devoured the landscape, erasing the world beyond the 4 walls of the cabin. They were trapped. For 3 days, the storm raged. It was a howling white prison, cutting them off from the world, sealing them in an intimacy that was both a comfort and a torment. The small cabin, which had been their sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The silence between them grew heavy, freighted with the weight of Dolly's threat and the charged emotions of their forced confinement. Fear was a constant presence. A third person in the room. They would start at every creak of the logs, every moan of the wind, imagining it was Dolly and his men, come to drag them out into the storm. But beneath the fear, other currents swirled. Grief was there, too. In the long, quiet hours, Clara's thoughts would drift back to the empty tin box, to the bitter taste of Elias's betrayal. Matthew found his own ghosts stirring, the memory of Samuel's face, pale and still in the Texas dust, rising unbidden in the flickering firelight. And then there was desire. It was a slow, deep ache that grew in the spaces between their words, in the accidental brush of their hands as they reached for the same log for the fire, in the long, searching looks they exchanged when they thought the other was not watching. It was a dangerous, tender thing, born of loneliness and a desperate need for human warmth in a world that had offered them nothing but cold. On the 3rd night, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow beat against the small window pane with a relentless rhythm. They sat by the fire, the tension in the cabin so thick it was almost impossible to breathe. Clara was staring into the flames, her face a pale oval in the flickering light, her expression lost and unbearably sad. She looked fragile, lost and achingly beautiful. Something inside Matthew, some long-locked door of restraint and self-denial, finally broke. He did not think, he only felt. He moved from his chair and knelt before her. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and a dawning, fearful question. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of pent-up loneliness and unspoken fears. It was a collision of two solitary souls, a raw and honest expression of all the emotion that had been churning between them in the silent cabin. For a moment, she was still, frozen in his arms. Then, with a soft, broken sound, she leaned into him, her lips parting under his, her hands coming up to grip his arms. But just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. She stiffened and pushed him away, scrambling back in her chair as if she had been burned. Her face was a mask of shame and self-loathing.
"No,"
she whispered, her voice choked.
"I cannot. Please do not."
"Clara," he started, his own voice rough.
"I am broken,"
she said, the words tearing from her. She hugged her arms around herself, her body trembling.
Elias, he broke something inside me. I cannot feel that way. I am ashamed of wanting, of needing comfort."
She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrible, bleak despair.
"I am sorry. Matthew, I am so sorry."
He looked at the raw pain on her face, and his own selfish needs withered and died. He saw not a woman rejecting him, but a wounded soul terrified of its own reflection. He stood up slowly, his heart a heavy, aching lump in his chest. He did not say a word. He went to his bedroll, picked up his blanket, and walked back to the hearth. He quietly laid the blanket out on the floor, on his side of the fire, a good 4 feet from where she sat. He was giving her space. He was giving her safety. It was a silent promise that he would not press, that he would not ask for more than she could give. He lay down on the blanket, his back to her, and stared into the fire. The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the logs and the howling of the wind. An hour passed. He thought she had finally cried herself to sleep. Then, he felt a tentative touch on his shoulder. He turned his head and saw her standing over him, her silhouette dark against the firelight. She did not speak. She simply knelt, and then lay down on the rug beside him, not on her own bedroll, but next to him. She curled up on her side, facing away from him, a small, fragile shape in the darkness. Then, hesitantly, she shifted, moving backward until her shoulders were pressed against his chest. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, and in moments, she was asleep. He lay there, rigid and awake, her warmth seeping into him, the soft weight of her body against his a thing of both profound comfort and exquisite pain. He did not move until the storm finally broke and the sun rose. The morning was brilliant and still. The world was a pristine, unbroken expanse of white. Matthew rose carefully, so as not to wake her. She was still asleep, her face peaceful in a way he had never seen it before. He pulled on his boots and coat and went outside. The air was frigid and sharp, the silence of the snow-covered world absolute. His first thought was water. The barrel by the side of the cabin would be frozen, but he could break the ice. He walked around the corner, and then he stopped dead. The water barrel was splintered, a jagged hole torn in its side. The ice and water that had been inside had spilled out, forming a frozen, glittering cascade down its staves. In the center of the jagged hole was a small, dark circle, a bullet hole. Dolly, the blizzard had ended, and this was his message. A warning shot, fired in the dead of night, a promise of what was to come. He heard the cabin door open behind him. Clara stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her hair pale in the morning sun. She saw the barrel, and her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She looked from the shattered barrel to Matthew's grim, set face, and she understood. She ran to him, her bare feet sinking into the snow. She grabbed the front of his coat, her expression pleading, her voice a desperate, broken whisper.
"No, Matthew, please, do not fight him. Not for me."
She looked up at him,
her eyes swimming with tears. "I have watched one man throw his life away for greed. I will not watch another throw his away for me. I am not worth it. Please, let me go. I do not want to cost another man his life." Clara's words, "I am not worth it," hung in the frigid morning air. A desperate plea born of a lifetime of being made to feel worthless. Matthew looked from the shattered water barrel to her tear-streaked face, and a cold, hard certainty settled in him, a resolve as solid as the frozen earth beneath his feet. He had spent years running from the ghost of a boy he could not save. He would not spend another moment running from a woman he could. "It is not for you to decide," he said, his voice low and rough, cutting through the stillness. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not harsh, forcing her to meet his gaze. "He did this not because of who you are, but because of who he is. This is not your fault. It is his." He released her and turned toward the small lean-to that served as his barn, his movements filled with a grim purpose. He would not wait for Dolly to make the next move. He would ride into town and face this head-on. He would give the law one last chance to be the law. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she followed him. "I am going to talk to the sheriff," he said, throwing a saddle onto Ajax's broad back. "I am going to tell him what Dolly is. And I am going to tell him that if he does not stop him, I will—" She watched him check his pistol, her face a mask of dread. "He will not listen. Men like Dolly own men like the sheriff." "Then I will know where I stand," he replied, and swung himself into the saddle. He looked down at her, at the fear and the fight in her eyes, and for a moment, he wanted nothing more than to stay, to lock the door and pretend the world outside did not exist. But that was not a choice they had any longer. "Bolt the door. Do not open it for anyone. I will be back before sundown." He rode away without another word, the crunch of Ajax's hooves on the fresh snow the only sound in the vast, white silence. The ride to town was a cold one, but the chill Matthew felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold dread of a man walking into a fight he did not want, but knew he could not avoid. Sheriff Brody was in his office, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at a stack of paperwork. He looked up when Matthew entered, his expression weary. He knew this was not a social call. "Rourke," he said with a sigh. "Let me guess. Frank Dolly." "He came up to my cabin last night," Matthew said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He shot out my water barrel. A warning." Brody ran a hand over his tired face. "Can you prove it was him?" "We both know it was him," Matthew countered, his patience fraying. "He wants Clara Elmswood. He wants the land. He told me he would get a warrant and drag her in to face charges. He is using the law to settle a personal score." "The law is a complicated thing." "Rourke," the sheriff said, avoiding his gaze. "Dolly has been talking to the circuit judge. He is well respected. He owns the largest ranch in this county. He is talking about bringing in more investors, about what is good for the town's future." He finally looked up, his eyes apologetic but firm. "His word carries a lot of weight, more weight than a drifter renting a line cabin. I cannot just go and arrest a man like Frank Dolly on your say-so. I need proof. I need a witness who is not you. Without that, my hands are tied." The words were a death sentence to Matthew's hope in the law. He saw the situation for what it was, a matter not of justice, but of power and politics. Dolly had the influence, and in a town like this, that was more potent than the truth. "So you are going to do nothing?" Matthew asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am advising you to be careful," Brody said, his voice low. "I am telling you that Frank Dolly is a snake, and you are standing on his tail. If I were you, I would ride out of this territory and not look back." "I am not you," Matthew said, and turned and walked out of the office, the door closing with a soft, final click behind him. He knew now that they were on their own. He did not ride straight back. His instincts, honed by years of solitude and survival,
screamed at him that something was wrong. Dolly was not a patient man. The warning shot, the pressure on the sheriff, it was all leading to something. He would not wait for a proper warrant, not when he could create his own. Matthew bypassed the main trail and took a lesser-known game path through the thick pine forest that bordered the ridge. He dismounted in a dense thicket that overlooked the trail to his cabin, his rifle in his hands. He settled in to wait, the cold seeping into his bones, his eyes scanning the path below. An hour passed, then another. Just as he was beginning to think he was wrong, he heard them. 2 riders, moving at a steady clip. They were not Dolly's usual ranch hands. These were hard-faced men, the kind who did dirty work for pay. One of them held a piece of paper in his gloved hand. A warrant. Matthew knew, as real as a $3 bill. Dolly had not waited. Matthew let them pass his hiding spot. He gave them 100 yards. Then he moved out onto the trail behind them, his horse's hooves silent in the deep snow. "That is far enough," he called out, his voice ringing with cold authority in the quiet woods. The 2 men reined in their horses, turning in their saddles. Their hands were already moving toward their pistols. "We have business up on the ridge," the first man said, his eyes narrow. "Your business is with me," Matthew said. He had his rifle leveled, not at the men, but at a point between them. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Clara Elmswood," the second man said, holding up the paper. "Issued by the county. We are deputies." "You are liars," Matthew said. "And that paper is not worth the ink on it. Turn around and ride back to whoever sent you. Tell him the next men he sends up here will be sent back in pine boxes." The first man sneered. "Big words for a man alone." He drew his pistol with a practiced speed, but Matthew had been waiting for it. He fired his rifle, not at the man, but at the heavy branch of a snow-laden pine just above his head. The bullet struck with a sharp crack, and a huge mass of snow and ice cascaded down, spooking the man's horse. The animal reared, screaming in panic, and the man's shot went wild, flying harmlessly into the trees. The second man was already off his horse, using it for cover as he fired. A bullet whizzed past Matthew's ear, close enough for him to feel its heat. He dropped from his saddle, rolling behind a fallen log as another shot splintered the wood where his head had been. He returned fire, his pistol now in his hand. The fight was a chaotic blur of noise and motion, of gunshots echoing through the silent woods and the panicked whinnying of horses. Matthew knew he could not stay pinned down. He scrambled from behind the log and charged, closing the distance before the man could get a clear shot. He slammed into him, and they went down in the snow, a tangle of limbs and curses. Matthew was stronger, but the man was desperate. He felt a searing, white-hot pain in his side and looked down to see the hilt of a knife protruding from his coat. The man had stabbed him. A wave of dizziness washed over him, but he fought it back with a surge of pure, cold rage. He landed a solid blow to the man's jaw, and he went limp. The first rider had managed to get his horse under control and was now firing wildly in their direction. Matthew, gritting his teeth against the fire in his side, took careful aim and fired. The man cried out and clutched his shoulder, dropping his pistol in the snow. He stared at Matthew with wide, fearful eyes, then spurred his horse and fled back down the trail. His wounded companion scrambled to his feet, gave Matthew one last look of terror, and stumbled after him into the woods. Silence descended once more. The only sounds were his own ragged breathing and the soft whisper of snow falling from the trees. He looked down at the knife. The blade was buried deep. He gripped the hilt and pulled. The pain was excruciating, a wave of agony that buckled his knees. He sank to the ground, the world tilting and fading at the edges. Blood, dark and shockingly red against the white snow, was spreading from the wound. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. He was losing too much blood. The cold was seeping in, a deep, final chill that had nothing to do with the snow. He closed his eyes, the memory of Samuel's face swimming in the darkness behind his lids. He had failed again.
He did not know how long he lay there. He was drifting, floating in a sea of gray, when he heard a voice calling his name. It was faint at first, then closer, more frantic. "Clara!" He felt her hands on his face, small and trembling. He forced his eyes open. She was kneeling over him, her face pale with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Matthew," she sobbed. "Oh, dear God, Matthew!" She saw the wound, the blood-soaked snow, and for a moment she looked as if she might break. But then, the same fierce resilience that had kept her alive in the ruins took over. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound. "You have to get up," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I cannot carry you. You have to help me." Somehow, with her help, he managed to get to his feet, leaning on her, stumbling and half-conscious. He made the agonizingly slow journey back to the cabin. He collapsed onto the cot, the world dissolving into a blur of pain and darkness. Through the haze, he was aware of her moving around him, her movements swift and purposeful. He felt her cutting away his coat and shirt. He heard her sobbing, a low, continuous sound of grief and fear as she saw the full extent of the wound. It was a deep, ugly gash, still seeping blood. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. She had a needle and thread from her sewing kit. She had heated the needle in the fire, and her hands were shaking as she brought it to his skin. The first stitch was a jolt of pure agony, and a groan escaped his lips. "I am sorry," she wept. "I am so sorry." She kept working, her tears falling onto his bare chest, her hands surprisingly steady as she pulled the thread tight, sewing the torn edges of his flesh back together. She was saving his life. He was drifting away, the darkness pulling at him like a tide. Her voice seemed to come from a great distance, a desperate, broken plea that pierced through the fog of his pain. "I have never begged a man to stay," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "Not for anything. But please, do not leave me." The words were his last anchor to consciousness. Then, the darkness took him completely. When he woke, the first thing he was aware of was the warmth of her hand holding his. The second was the dull, throbbing ache in his side. The cabin was quiet, bathed in the soft, orange glow of a low fire. He turned his head and saw her asleep in the chair beside the cot, her head slumped forward, her hand still clutching his as if she were afraid he might vanish if she let go. He gently squeezed her hand, and her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, and a wave of profound relief washed over her face, so powerful it was almost painful to see. "You are awake," she breathed. "Thanks to you," he said, his voice a dry rasp. She shook her head, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I had lost you. I thought he had won." "He has not won," Matthew said. He looked at their joined hands, at the woman who had faced down her own terror to save him, who had stitched his body and, in doing so, had stitched herself into his soul. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart, the walls of grief and solitude, crumbled into dust. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. She watched him, her eyes wide and searching. He saw no fear in them now, only a deep, aching vulnerability that mirrored his own. He slowly sat up, ignoring the sharp protest from his side. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. All the barriers between them, all the unspoken fears and desires, had been burned away in the crucible of the last 24 hours. What was left was a raw and undeniable truth. They were two broken, solitary people who had found in each other a reason not just to survive, but to live. He drew her gently toward him, and she came without hesitation. Their mouths met, and this kiss was nothing like the desperate, frantic kiss in the blizzard. It was slow and deep, and filled with a profound and sorrowful tenderness. It was a kiss heavy with the weight of all the pain they had endured, a quiet surrender to their shared need.
He laid her down on the narrow cot, and in the warm, flickering light of the fire, they made love. It was not an act of passion, but of solace. It was a slow, emotional unfolding, a language of touch that spoke of comfort and acceptance. It was the gentle, careful mapping of each other's scars, both visible and hidden. It was a final, absolute surrender to their vulnerability, a quiet promise made in the dark that they were no longer alone. The next morning, they awoke in each other's arms, the light of a new day streaming through the window. A quiet resolve had settled between them. They both knew what they had to do. "We will leave," he said, his voice soft in the morning stillness. "We will go north, into the mountains. We will find a place where no one knows our names." A small, hopeful smile touched her lips for the first time. "Together?" "Together," he affirmed. They began to make their preparations. They had little to pack, but what they had, they gathered with a sense of purpose. This was not running. It was a new beginning. As Matthew was checking his wound, which was painful but clean, he smelled it, the acrid, unmistakable scent of smoke. He went to the door and looked out. A thick plume of black smoke was billowing into the clear morning sky from the direction of the lean-to. His heart seized in his chest. He ran outside, Clara close behind him. The lean-to was an inferno. The dry timbers of the small barn were engulfed in flames, roaring and crackling in the cold air. Inside, he could hear the terrified, final scream of his horse. Ajax, his loyal companion, his only link to his past, was gone. Everything he owned, his saddle, his tack, his tools, his horse, was turning to ash. Dolly, in a final, cowardly act of malice, had taken everything from him. He stood there, helpless, watching the flames consume the last vestiges of his solitary life. He felt Clara's hand slide into his, her grip tight and desperate. "He has taken everything," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "This is my fault." Matthew turned and looked at her. He looked at her face, smudged with soot and fear, but with a strength in her eyes that the fire could not touch. He looked at the woman who had begged him not to leave, who had held his hand while he slept, who had surrendered her own broken heart to his. Dolly had taken his horse, his barn, his possessions, but he had not taken everything. He had not taken what mattered. "He has taken nothing," Matthew said, his voice clear and steady above the roar of the fire. He pulled her closer, his gaze locked on hers. "You are the only thing I will not lose." The fire had taken everything but the ground it stood on. Matthew stood before the smoking, blackened timbers of the lean-to, the place where his horse had died, where the last tangible pieces of his solitary life had been turned to ash. The rising sun cast long shadows across the snow, and the air was sharp with the bitter smell of wet, burned wood. Beside him, Clara stood in silence, her hand held tightly in his. The warmth of her grip was the only thing that felt real in the cold, desolate morning. They did not speak of running anymore. The time for running was over. Dolly had not just burned a barn. He had ignited a fuse. To flee now would be to let him win, to let his violence and greed erase them from the world. There was only one path left, a path that led not away from the town, but directly into its heart. "We will walk," Matthew said, his voice a low rumble. It was a long way, but the decision felt right. A man on a horse could be seen as a threat or a target. Two people walking, stained with soot and weariness, were a different kind of spectacle. They were a story, and it was time for that story to be told. Clara simply nodded, her eyes fixed on his, a quiet strength in their depths that he had never seen before. The fear was still there, a shadow behind the light, but it no longer controlled her. In the crucible of the fire, she had been forged into something new, something that would not break. They started down the ridge, their boots crunching in the snow. The world was beautiful and still, indifferent to the turmoil in their hearts. With every step, Matthew could feel the dull throb in his side where the knife had been, a physical reminder of the price of this fight. He looked at Clara walking beside him, her head held high, and he knew it was a price he would pay again. It took them 3 hours to reach the outskirts of the town. By the time they did, the sun was high in the sky. People were out, going about their business, their faces pinched from the cold. The first person who saw them stopped dead in the middle of the street, a sack of flour clutched in his hand. He stared, his mouth agape, first at Matthew's grim, soot-stained face, and then at the woman beside him, the ghost of Clara Elmswood. A murmur went through the street like a wind through dry grass. People stopped what they were doing. Faces appeared in windows, doors opened, the whispers started. A low, sibilant sound that followed them as they walked down the center of the main street. They did not stop. They did not look to the left or the right. They walked with a slow, deliberate purpose, their destination in the saloon, the place where a man like Frank Dolly would be holding court, basking in the glow of his petty victory. And there he was. Dolly was standing on the boardwalk with 2 of his men, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smug, triumphant look on his face. When he saw them, his expression faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise and fury in his eyes. He had not expected this. He had expected them to be a pile of ashes or a fading memory on a northbound trail. He recovered quickly, his lips twisting into a contemptuous sneer. "Well, look what the blizzard blew in," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. The gathering crowd grew silent, hungry for the drama that was about to unfold. "Rourke, and the thief's wife, I see you found your way out of the ashes." Matthew stopped in the middle of the street, a good 20 feet from the boardwalk. He stood with his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, his presence a silent, immovable challenge. But this was not his fight to lead. Clara stepped forward. She moved with a grace and a poise that seemed impossible for a woman who had been through so much. She was no longer the skittish, frightened creature he had found in the ruins. She was calm, her gaze fixed on Dolly, her voice clear and steady when she spoke, carrying across the silent street. "My husband was a thief, Mr. Dolly," she began, and a collective gasp went through the crowd. "He was also a coward, and he was a brute. The town was right about that." Dolly's sneer widened. "Finally telling the truth. Are you? Did you come to turn over the gold he stole from me?" "He stole nothing from you," Clara replied, her voice unwavering. "The gold he was supposed to be guarding was never stolen. It was a lie. A lie you told so you could put pressure on him, so you could force him to sell you his land, the land you have always wanted." Dolly's face began to darken. "That is a ridiculous accusation. The woman is delirious." "Am I?" Clara continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd, the men and women who had whispered about her, who had judged her without knowing a thing. "My husband planned to run. He told me so. He was a weak man, and you hounded him until he saw no other way out. He was going to abandon his home, his name, and his wife." She paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the street was absolute. Then she took a deep breath and delivered the final, terrible truth, a confession that was also an absolution. "The night of the fire," she said, her voice dropping but losing none of its clarity. "We argued. He told me he was leaving me. He struck me. The oil lamp fell. The fire started so fast. It was everywhere. He was trapped in the back room." Her gaze found Dolly again, and it was as sharp and as hard as a shard of glass. "I could have tried to get help. I could have screamed, but I stood on the porch and I watched the flames, and I did not say a word. I let him die." A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. The whispers now were not of gossip, but of disbelief and a dawning, horrified understanding. Clara stood her ground, letting their judgment wash over her. "I am not a thief," she said, her voice rising with a strength that came from the very core of her being. "I never saw any stolen gold. I never took a thing from that house that was not on my back." When Matthew Rourke found me, I was half dead, freezing in the ruins of my own life. I have done many things I am ashamed of. I stayed too long with a man who hurt me. I was a coward. But everything I have done since that fire, every single thing, was only to stay alive. She looked out at the faces of her accusers, at the men who had condemned her and the women who had turned their backs on her. I only ever tried to survive. The street was silent. No one moved. In the eyes of the townsfolk, a strange and complex mixture of emotions played out. Some of the men looked away, a flush of shame on their faces. They had been so quick to believe the worst, to join in the condemnation. Some of the women looked at Clara with a new expression, a quiet, reluctant recognition of her courage, of the desperate choices a woman in her position might be forced to make. Frank Dolly saw his power over the crowd slipping away. He saw the tide of their opinion turning, and it sent him into a rage. "She is a murderer!" he roared, his face purple with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "She admitted it. She let him burn. Are you going to stand here and let a killer walk free? String her up." He tried to incite them, to turn their shock into a mob's violence. But his words were too desperate, his hatred too naked. Before anyone could move, another figure stepped forward. Sheriff Brody. He had been standing at the edge of the crowd, listening. His face was grim, his eyes hard. He walked past Matthew and Clara and stopped at the foot of the boardwalk, looking up at Dolly. "That is enough, Frank," the sheriff said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of the law. "Enough!" Dolly shrieked. "Are you deaf, Brody? Arrest her!" "The only person I am arresting today is you," the sheriff said. He held up a piece of paper. It was not the forgery Dolly had created. "This is a real warrant for the arrest of Frank Dolly on charges of conspiracy, forgery, and attempted murder." Dolly stared at him, his mouth working but no sound coming out. "Two men tried to serve a forged warrant on Mrs. Elmswood a few days ago," the sheriff announced to the stunned crowd. "They were hired guns. One of them got himself caught downriver yesterday. He was very talkative. He talked about who hired him. He talked about a plan to get rid of Matthew Rourke and take the woman. He talked about who gave him the order to burn a barn last night." Brody's gaze was like granite. "Your lies have run out, Frank." Dolly, cornered and exposed, made one last, desperate move. He lunged for his pistol, but he was no gunman. Matthew was faster. He had his own pistol out in a single, fluid motion, but he did not have to fire. The sheriff was faster still. He drew his own weapon and brought the heavy barrel down hard on Dolly's wrist. Dolly howled in pain, his pistol clattering to the boardwalk, his two ranch hands, seeing the tide had turned so completely, raised their hands in surrender. The law, slow and reluctant, had finally arrived. As Sheriff Brody snapped handcuffs onto Dolly's wrists and read him his rights, a quiet sense of justice settled over the street. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, sober tones, their world upended by a truth they had never expected to hear. In the quiet aftermath, Matthew and Clara stood alone in the middle of the street. It was over. The whispers, the accusations, the threat that had hung over them for so long, it was all gone. Matthew reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was his claim to the line cabin and the 160 acres that went with it, signed and dated. He held it out to her. "This is yours," he said. "You can stay. It is a safe place. No one will bother you now." It was all he had left to give her, a piece of paper that represented a roof and a patch of ground, a home. Clara looked at the paper in his hand, and then she looked up at his face. A soft, gentle smile touched her lips. She shook her head and pushed his hand, and the paper, back toward his chest. "I do not want the land. Matthew," she said, her voice soft. She reached up and placed her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle and sure. "I would rather stay where you stay." They left the town that afternoon. They bought 2 sturdy mountain horses and supplies with the last of Matthew's cattle money. They rode north, away from the plains and the painful memories they held, toward the high, lonely peaks of the mountains. They did not look back. They found their place a week later, a small, abandoned cabin nestled in a high meadow, surrounded by towering pines and the silence of the ancient peaks. It was rough and needed work, but it was sound. And it was theirs. They had nothing but what they carried in their saddlebags. But as they stood on the small porch and looked out at the vast, beautiful wilderness, they knew they had everything they needed. That night, they built a fire in the stone hearth. The flames pushed back the darkness, filling the small cabin with a warm, dancing light. They lay side by side on a bed of pine boughs and blankets, the silence between them no longer a thing of fear or tension, but of a deep and abiding peace. As the fire burned low, Clara turned to him in the darkness. She was a silhouette against the dying embers, her face hidden in shadow. She whispered the same words she had spoken on that first night, the words that had bound them together. "Don't leave until I fall asleep." This time the words were not a plea born of terror, but a soft, contented murmur, a prayer of thanksgiving. Matthew gathered her closer, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even against his chest. He stayed, just as he always had. He watched the last of the embers fade to gray. He listened to the sound of her sleeping, a sound that had become the rhythm of his own heart, and for the first time in more than a decade, as he held her in his arms, Matthew Rourke closed his eyes and finally slept without dreaming of the past. Thank you for listening to this story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.